Welcome everybody to our last webinar, LandGate webinar of the year. And I hope you guys are excited as I am to have Neil on the webinar with us today. We're going to be talking about carbon credits and carbon deals and how that landscape is changing quickly and may have even changed by the time me and Neil are done with our conversation here. But for those of you who are new to our LandGate webinars, these are very, very open, educational type of webinars where we try to get as much knowledge and information out to landowners, land professionals as possible. And that's really the goal. So these are very interactive webinars, if you will. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here. I'm going to go through a couple of slides talking about carbon credits, what they are, what they mean. Me and Neil are going to discuss some of our views of what we're seeing in the market. But at any time, we really like engagement from the audience there. At any time, if you have a question, please email them into Michaela. Her email is mb@landgate.com. You can see that on the screen there. Any questions you have relating to carbon credits, your land, any other types of resources on your land at all, that's also feel free to shoot those out there. Neil deals with carbon quite a bit, and he also does some other types of natural resources as does LandGate. Quick house cleaning. This webinar is being recorded, so if you want to go back and watch the discussion, you will be receiving a link later on of this recorded email. And we also have, as some of you know, this is a webinar series. So throughout the year, we talk about all different types of topics ranging from solar energy, wind energy, oil and gas minerals, carbon credits, EV charging. At any time, you can go back and review some of those other webinars where we've had some other land professionals in and talking about those specific resources as well. Real quick pitch, LandGate, for those of you who don't know, we are a phenomenal resource for land professionals and landowners. We are a data analytics platform and a marketplace for land and trying to make money off of land. If you're trying to generate revenue through carbon credits, solar energy, wind energy, water rights, mineral rights, LandGate is the open marketplace, the world's largest marketplace for that. So you can post your own listing, you can post your own listing, edit it, delete it. Or if you're working with a land professional like Neil, make sure they're aware of LandGate and they can go ahead and represent your property on the world's largest natural resource marketplace, and that is LandGate. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Neil. And some of you have probably met him before in some of our other webinars, but Neil comes to us today as with a wealth of knowledge about land transactions, how landowners can look at property, not just as a place to live on and put a cabin on, but how you can turn that into a revenue generating asset for yourselves. And what we're going to be talking about today specifically is how you can generate that revenue from carbon credits. So Neil, welcome to the webinar again. Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, Neil, it's funny, and I'm sure you get this a lot talking with clients and landowners, and you bring up the concept of carbon credits, and it's like a cow looking at a new gate. Where what do you mean carbon? What do you mean by carbon credits? So what we'll do here in the first couple minutes, we put together a couple slides to explain what are we talking about when it comes to carbon credits, and just to clear differentiator of what we're talking about here. When we're referring to carbon credits, we're talking about voluntary land-based carbon credits. So carbon credits that will be tied to the surface of land parcels. Okay. What a carbon credit is essentially is a credit or a monetary incentive to promote sequestration on land by increasing the vegetative health on that specific property. We're going to talk about a couple different types of contracts that you can enter into, different types of carbon contracts. But in a nutshell, that is what we're talking about. How much carbon dioxide is being pulled out of the atmosphere and into the soils of a certain parcel. Now, on the other side of that equation, right, if you're sitting in your home or on your phone in a car or whatever, listening to this and saying, okay, I got trees on my property, I grow alfalfa on my property, whatever it is, you have things pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. On the other side of the equation, there are human processes that emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So on the other side of the equation, those folks are doing their best to sequester and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that they put into the atmosphere. Or they can't fundamentally shut down what they do for their business. A jet is still going to have exhaust, and a pickup truck and all of these other things are going to emit CO2. So those companies on a voluntary basis are saying, we will, for how much CO2 we emit into the atmosphere, we are going to compensate another side of the equation of folks that are sequestering and trying to get that into equilibrium or a balance there and becoming what they'll call net neutral. Okay, so you have emitters of carbon dioxide, you have sequesters of carbon dioxide. So that's essentially what we're talking about. That is the exchange between what a carbon credit is, a monetary incentive for people who are emitting carbon dioxide to people who are sequestering carbon dioxide. That's a carbon credit. That is what we're talking about with a voluntary carbon credit. Multiple different types. There's forestry carbon credits that are based on tree types and densities, all of these different variables that impact how much carbon dioxide a certain tree is going to sequester. A tree in a sequoia tree in a rainforest in the West Coast is going to sequester significantly more carbon dioxide than a ponderosa pine tree where I live and in Colorado, because of the different types of wood, different types of species, basically all tied back to the amount of precipitation you get. Then you have agriculture and grassland type of carbon credits where depending on what you're doing for operational practices on farming, ranching, things like that, you can increase the soil health or decrease the soil health, and you can get a monetary incentive for increasing that soil health based on agriculture and grassland. Typically, what we've seen, the forestry contracts are a little bit shorter. The agriculture contracts are a little bit longer there. Again, real quick point, carbon credits are driven almost entirely by photosynthesis. How much vegetation do you have, which is a direct result of how much sunlight do you have, how much precipitation do you get. Okay, so those are kind of your main variables. If you're thinking right now, is my parcel good for carbon credits or bad for carbon credits? If you have a parcel here, if you're looking at this map, this is a tree canopy density map from the eastern seaboard of the United States. If you have a parcel and you're sitting in West Virginia, you likely have a much higher likelihood, far more photosynthesis is taking place on your property than a parcel in the middle of Nye County, Nevada. Okay, just because of those different variables that we talked about there. So at the end of the day, how much carbon dioxide is being sequestered by that property? Carbon dioxide is plant food. So more plants you have, more carbon dioxide you're pulling out of the atmosphere. Again, major variables of tree types, different soil types can impact how much carbon you can sequester. And again, different kind of categories there. You have grasslands, types of carbon credits, and farming carbon credits. So these slides will be shared with you. Follow up. These are very basic, kind of high level, and that's kind of what we want this webinar to be. We don't want to give a PhD dissertation about carbon credits, but the real goal of this is what does this mean for you? What kind of applications does this mean for a typical landowner? And Neil, this is really why we want you to be on this call, is you come from a very unique perspective. You own land, you own significant properties that are capturing a lot of photosynthesis, has a lot of vegetation on the property. But you also, this is your profession. You are a land professional, and you work with landowners, and you help them sell property, you help them buy property. What is your what has been your perspective so far in both of those camps as a landowner and a land professional?
Yeah.
Have you heard about carbon credits? Has it been a big part of what you do in both of those segments?
Um, well, thanks for having me on, by the way. And if I could just introduce myself really quick,
Please
so
do.
you can
Absolutely.
look more into me. I'm a land specialist real estate agent with Whitetail Properties Real Estate. I'm out of Northwest Wisconsin. I cover about 7 counties in the western part of the state here, and I'm a land owner and land investor, and I'm a licensed real estate agent. But more than anything, I think I'm a consultant to my clients that are looking to buy land just for land ownership or maybe as an investor. And this whole idea of carbon credits kind of popped onto my radar probably a couple of years ago, actually, when I met Craig and started talking about the software and all the different data that's in there. But I kind of started melting it down into what I think was more important to my local people, and carbon kept coming right to the top, and probably solar next. So we're talking about carbon today. And so I started hearing about this, carbon credits and the carbon footprint and all this. And I started asking a question. So I went around and talked to some landowner buddies of mine, and we started analyzing their properties with the software. And according to the software, the algorithm said that some of us had some significant potential carbon credit payouts that might come from somebody that wants to buy, like kind of give us credit for our sequestration ability of our land. So that's where it all started for me. And I started as part of my daily business, kind of consulting with landowners, number one, that were kind of on the fence maybe about selling their land, and I wanted to be seen not so much as a salesperson. That's just I'm so one dimensional. I want to say, all right, I want to be a professional for you. I want to be a consultant. I want to elevate myself because I have so much knowledge, much more knowledge in my head than just listing your property. So let's talk about all the opportunities. So that's where we started talking about carbon credit. Just kind of, although it was maybe a smaller opportunity, it was an opportunity that kind of resonated with a lot of people. And that all happened, and it seemed to be ramping up over the last year.
Yeah, I think we've seen the same thing, and just again, so you guys all know, the LandGate's open marketplace allows landowners or land professionals like Neil to list properties just to simply get it out on the market for carbon credits and kind of test the waters. They get some data analytics through LandGate and say, okay, well, this might be of interest. Well, now go ahead and take it into the marketplace and see if there's carbon developers, companies that would actually sign a contract, right, with you, Neil, and say, okay, well, we'll pay you this monetary amount right now. You'll sign a contract with that carbon company, and then that carbon company will actually turn it into a carbon credit. And I think that's what's important. We can touch on that here in a little bit, but to get it out into that process, that's what people use LandGate for. And we've seen levels of interest with almost every single landowner across the United States. Every landowner wants to know, what is this something that they can do on their property? And what do they have to do? And Neil, if you want to touch on that a little bit, I think that's why there's so much interest there, is because it's not that invasive as far as possible revenue, right? Do you want to touch on that, Neil?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that, because that's a question that comes up quite a bit, is like revenue and how to create revenue on your property. And a lot of people, I don't think have a real broad perspective beyond the normal things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I know, and that is this upper Midwest, Western Wisconsin. We have a lot of tillable ground, kind of broken farmland. It's mixed with woods and swamp. And so we have a lot of recreational land, and is my main focus of doing business. And so I'd sit down with these people and we would talk about, well, why do you want to sell your land? Well, I need some revenue because I'm older and I'm retiring, and I know the market's up, so I'd like to sell my property. And talking to them, as I got to be more knowledgeable about the software, I started consulting with them and say, Well, if you looked at other avenues of revenue, I mean, I'd love to sell your property, and that's obviously my goal, and that's my main goal. I want to come and sell your land. But let's talk about other things that you may not even understand. And in the process, what I am doing is I'm developing a higher level relationship. So if you're a land specialist, you want to be, or you're a real estate agent, maybe you're an investor, elevating yourself in the mind of your client is always a good thing. So obviously you want to sell their land. But so we started talking about that, and he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, like, how are you making money from your land now? Well, you could rent your tillable ground. And in my area, you might get $100 an acre. That's pretty average. And depending on how many acres, do the math, you get 20 acres, you get $2,000 a year. You could lease your property for hunting. That's depending on, again, the location. If it's Buffalo County, you might get 10 grand a year. If it's Russ County or Polk County, you might get $1,500 a year, but there's a continuum. But now you got to let somebody on your land. You lose the right of quiet enjoyment, the right to use your property. So that may not resonate with you. You can sell your timber, and you can reduce your taxes by signing up for special programs like the Managed Forest Law Program. They'll come in and timber your property. They'll give you lower taxes. And about every 15 years, you have a revenue stream because you've cut your timber. Not everybody wants to do that. So then I started talking about, well, have you ever heard of carbon credits? Are you familiar with that? And Craigie went over it really well. And they're like, no, I don't understand what that is. I said, well, let me just, on a real high level, Amazon is going to come and make a 90,000 square foot facility in Baldwin, Wisconsin. They're going to produce carbon, and they want to offset that by buying the ability and a credit from your land, because your land absorbs the carbon that they produce. That's a high level, and they will give you money for that. And the inevitable question is, okay, well, what do I got to give up in order to get that money? Well, first off, you got to get somebody that's interested in doing that. And that's where the marketplace comes in. As Craig said, we could list your property for rent or sale or for whatever credits on the marketplace. And then you can come. So you got to get an interested party to come and do that. But what I found is, in the few people that have actually signed these deals, it's ranged everywhere from, it might be a 20-year contract where they're involved in your business in a sense for a long period of time for that contract, all the way down to, a friend of mine did a 1-year contract. They never stepped foot on his property. I think they took aerial photos, and they have data that they could tell what's there. And they said, okay, we'll sign you up for a 1-year agreement. He had 200-ish acres, and I think he got $6,900 for a 1-year contract, but it wasn't renewed. I don't know if he didn't renew it or the company is no longer there. And talking to Craig, maybe the company's no longer in business. That business model wasn't so hot, I guess. So this whole carbon credit world and carbon footprints, kind of like, I tell people, it's kind of the wild, wild west. But it's a real opportunity it's out there, and it's worth looking into. And that's why we're talking about it today.
Yeah, you're exactly right. As far as where the state of maturity is in this industry, it's just starting. And Neil, we've had conversations like that for quite a while now. Is what's going on in the market now? Who's in the marketplace offering these monetary contracts to landowners? And the way the market looks today is going to look completely different in next year, 2 years, 3 years from now. It's changing very, very quickly. And Neil, the example you brought up with your friend, the other landowner, 200 acres and getting paid $6,900 for a 12-month contract. He wasn't wanting to cut his trees down anyway.
No.
So why not? And that's a really good point. Is you went through a couple other land uses there, farming it. There's encumbrances there, having a farmer come on your property, and they're going to use your property, hunting, recreation. From what we've seen, most of the encumbrances for carbon credits, and that seems to what's piquing a lot of landowners' interest, is the encumbrances are very minimal, where there is going to be, and in each carbon developer works a little bit differently with what they will require the landowner to do, because the landowner has to do something in order to get paid the carbon credit, whether that's through active forest management or regenerative agriculture practices, something like that. They do have to make some sort of alteration to what they've been doing, but for the most part, it's not nearly as invasive of some of the other resources you talked about. And Neil, I know you've helped a lot of landowners with, whether it be solar, wind, battery storage, minerals, things like that. This is a much more passive type of potential revenue income. But like you said, the market is changing very, very quickly. Whereas your friend, $6,900 one year, it's not something that he could take to the bank and go get a loan off of. But it's absolutely worth looking into for, because every parcel's a little bit different, right, Neil? I mean, a forested parcel is going to be quite a bit different than a dry land wheat parcel out here in the Great Plains.
Right. So if with carbon, and this is a little bit of a generality, folks that are listening to this, but carbon is really well suited for properties that have a lot of trees. There are carbon credit companies that will do business or are trying to do business with farming or grassland, so it's out there. But my expertise is somebody that has a lot of trees. The questions that people come up with all the time are, how do they know? Like, how do they know what's there? I don't understand. Like, how do they determine the value? And no expert on this, but I know when I did my LandGate report on my own farm, it gave me data on species, age, class, diversity, volume. There was a lot of data there, and I'm guessing it's all satellite or algorithmic, data that has been pulled in. So believe it or not, there's ways to do it. Technology is a pretty amazing thing. One thing that I've found or heard is that they really don't like you cutting down trees, which on one hand, from a guy that's got some education through Whitetail Properties, we were trained on this stuff. I would push back on that, and that's cutting trees is a bad thing is basically the message. We don't want to cut down trees because we're destroying the Amazon and the carbon's going through the roof, and we can't cut down your trees. And I would almost argue that by cutting down one tree, you create a basal area stem count of many 10 times the amount of that one tree that you cut down with the regeneration and the carbon sequestration capability of a property that has so much more surface area of leaf. If you think about the number of leaves from one tree versus thousands of saplings that sprout, might be greater. But that is something that, in my experience so far, is kind of a negative. Like, we don't want you cutting down your trees. So if you're a landowner like me who manages my land by cutting down trees, believe it or not, and it makes actually my habitat better, well, that's something you might want to look into. Another thing that I've sensed from people is, I don't want government involvement in my land, but they do want the money that comes from that. So there's a pro and con there in the fact that when you sign up on these contracts, you're going to have somebody telling you what you can and cannot do. Except for in the case of my buddy, I asked him, how much involvement did they have? And he says, I haven't seen anybody. Nobody came to my property that I'm aware of. So maybe that's the other end of the spectrum, because it's the wild, wild west, and it could be all over the spectrum. The length of these contracts is something we should talk about. Just recently in the Wisconsin Outdoor News, it's a weekly newspaper that's kind of geared towards outdoorsmen and hunters, fishermen, landowners in Wisconsin. There was an article where the state of Wisconsin is actually promoting carbon credits for landowners, and they gave a link to a company that's doing it. So I clicked on it and looked at it very briefly, but it was a 20-year commitment on that property if you were to make a deal with them. So you're in for it for 20 years, which, you got to be careful about that, because an encumbrance on your property, maybe you sell it in 5 years, but maybe you started out thinking, I'm never selling it, but you had a death or a divorce or financial need, and you decided, I need to sell that. I could tell you from a land specialist that when you have these encumbrances, no matter what it is, even if it seems beneficial, and it might be financially beneficial for tax reduction or payments like the carbon credits, many buyers, I would argue, 60% or more, are negatively affected. They'll walk away. They won't want to buy your property. So that's something you got to think about. Is like, if I get into this contract, how does it affect my future?
Yeah,
And we don't always
yeah,
know.
that's right. And I think that's really any type of encumbrance that you could put on that property. It's going to affect one way or another. In one way, it could radically increase the value of your property. In other ways, it could deter and erode the value of the property. And I think I'd like to get your perspective on this, Neil, because um, it seems to me that when a lot of landowners, when they'll reach out to LandGate with questions, things like that, in their mind, they're asking, is this a conservation easement? Because when you hear that word conservation easement, a lot of folks in their mind, like that's a perpetual thing. Just like you said, you're going to have the government or somebody in your backyard forever. And we've tried, I'll tell you our perspective on it, Neil, and you let me know what you think is looking at it as a conservation easement. I don't think is the right way to do it. I think we look at it more of it's a lease, right? So if you threw out a couple of terms there as far as 5-year term or a 20-year term or a 50-year term. Uh, Not a lot of landowners are used to lease agreements that are that long, especially if you're talking about farming or recreation. I mean, very few folks would probably grant, Neil, you probably wouldn't grant the right for me to go hunt your property for 50 years,
No.
right? But what you're seeing in some of these other natural resources is longer term contracts are very, very typical. And when I'm talking natural resources, I'm talking um, solar energy, wind energy, now carbon credits, mineral leases are usually longer term if you can get production. So I think that the mentality that folks need to be looking at it is these are somewhat longer term contracts, and they are fairly similar to what you'd see with a solar contract of 30 to 40 years or a wind turbine contract or an oil and gas contract that is essentially perpetual until the production stops. So that's kind of what we've seen. And once we explained it to landowners in that context, it shifted the idea away from this is a conservation easement and this could be the last thing that I ever do because it's more of a conservation easement. What kind of feeling have you had as a landowner? Is that the feeling that you had when you were looking and understanding some of these contracts? And what have some of the folks that you've been working with? I mean, how are they viewing these contracts?
All right. Well, let's stratify these theoretical people into maybe two groups. One is I'm buying land. I'm going to buy 500 acres of timbered land in Polk County, Wisconsin. And my whole goal and my plan is I'm an investor and I buy land instead of buying stocks and bonds and whatnot. I buy land and I'm going to hold that land for a long time. I'm not buying it for hunting, although it may have great hunting. I'm not buying it because I'm going to develop it. I'm kind of storing my money there because I know it's very solid. It's a finite resource and it's probably going to increase at a very steady rate at 3 to 6% a year, depending. And I'm never going to lose my money and it's only going up. So I've got buyers like that, landowners, and they contacted me about these carbon credit ideas because it's just another financial vertical. So the financial verticals for a guy like that might be timber. That's obvious. Okay. So you put it in the managed forest law program, which is not a conservation easement. It's 25 or 50 years, and every 10 to 15 years it's cut. They take off the timber and you get paid for it. So that's one business vertical. Then you could take that and you could sign up hunting leases. And some of these large tracts that are owned by the state and sometimes by individual people, paper companies, even corporate, they might sign long-term hunting leases every year for, I've heard 90-year leases, 50-year leases, and people pay for them. And that's a revenue stream. Then there's minerals under that ground. There might be in northern Wisconsin, it might be iron ore or gold even, or in Ohio, it might be natural gas. There's mineral rights to that. And they could sell those mineral rights or lease those mineral rights and they create another revenue stream there. And then maybe there's solar capacity and maybe there's EV electric, charging station capacities because of the location. And then there's carbon. So there are people that have the wherewithal to investigate all of these different coexisting revenue streams that sometimes, and I think the future is that this land is worth a lot more than just the cost per acre of the dirt that it sits on. There's a lot more revenue streams. And so I think theoretically, a guy could sit with Craig or me or another guy that uses the software and say, I want to know beyond how much cost per acre can you sell my land? How much revenue can I create from these other verticals? And if I'm a business guy and I'm going to say, sure, hire me as your consultant. I'm the benefactor. I take care of the contract and the negotiation. I'm your partner in this, and I'm glad to do that. It's part of my business. Or you could probably do it on your own if you don't want all my knowledge and you're just looking at one segment, carbon credits, little teeny segment, forgo the rest. And I'm just going after that. And then you maybe don't need my source of knowledge. You can go right to the software. It can do it. So that's one segment of a potential scenario that we're talking. Multiple business verticals, multiple revenue streams, all that potentially can coexist depending on the contracts that you sign with each of those. Because there's going to be pros and cons, and there's the yin and there's the yang of these agreements, right? The other side of this might be a guy that's selling this property. I'm going to sell it, and I just want to get the maximum dollars that I can. Well, the software might be really valuable for that guy when I can sit down with you and say, do you know that you have $48,000 a year of potential carbon credits? I have a friend in northern Wisconsin in Rusk County. I won't give an exact, but Rusk County, Wisconsin, all wooded, all forested, swamp. His data said that he had $48,000 a year of potential carbon credit, and that was only carbon credit. Didn't count the timber that was there, and I gave him the species and the volume. How valuable would that be if he went and talked to a forester or a logger and got a bid and said, well, actually, my 60% of my volume here is white oak, and you never mentioned anything about that. But I've got this data that says this is what I've got, and pretty much get it for free on the LandGate software. You have mineral rights. You might be in a location for solar. You might be in a location for charging stations. There's just all this data. So if you're a seller, you're thinking about selling your land, wouldn't you want to know everything possible about your land? Knowledge is power. And I'll tell you, if you ran this report, you're going to know more than 99% of people out there. And I'm not trying to oversell the report. I'm just telling you that data is there. And when I sit down in front of somebody, I tell you, they kind of sit back and they scratch their head and go, holy cow, how did you get all this? I'm like, well, it's available to everybody. I just happen to utilize it. Then there's the buyer. So we've talked about an investor, a seller. Now it's going to the buyer. A buyer coming to the table, maybe not sharing this knowledge with the person that you're going to sit down across, because their agent doesn't understand this, doesn't have a clue this data even exists, doesn't understand that there's mineral rights, timber rights, carbon rights, solar, all these things. If you only looked at the carbon credit of a large wooded parcel, and assuming you can get a contract with a company that'll pay you for that carbon credit, the amount of income that you can create from your purchase is outstanding. And it's across the board. It's small parcels, smaller numbers, big parcels, bigger numbers. But that data that is there just on carbon credits alone, so that's what we're talking about, can really skew in a very positive sense the return on investment, internal rates of return, however you want to calculate. There's real money that nobody understands is sitting out there waiting for somebody to get. And it's very, very early in the entire thing. But the idea of carbon footprint isn't going away. The cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on there, Neil. I would add one more segment to that. The fourth segment is the landowner who is never going to sell that piece of property. The landowner, I'm going to sit on this thing, and Neil, you're a wealth of knowledge. I want to make more money on my property too. How do I do that? I'm not going to sell. So don't talk to me about selling if you even tell me. And we hear that a lot is Well, we hear from landowners, well, we really like LandGate because
Yeah.
the first thing you do is not try to tell me to sell my property, which is why for all of the other land professionals on the call, what I try to do is guide them into say, stop calling yourself a realtor. Stop calling yourself a real estate agent. That is your profession. That's what you're doing. You're licensed and great. But whenever you talk to a landowner like me, who I'm never going to sell my property, the one thing goes through my head is they're going to try to get me to sell my property.
Yeah.
Where as a land professional like you, Neil, you've been mentioning all these other things, all these other potential revenue things that I've never even thought of as a landowner. You come to me as a land professional and you say, Craig, this is what I do for a living. Have you even, and you've already looked at my property in LandGate through your application, and you know more about my property. And that's a similar tie to all of the segments you talked about. The leg up each one of them has is information. You already would have more information about my property. I do not care how long I've lived here or if it was passed down from my great grandfather. You are going to have more information through that technology to know technical information about that property than I do, which you're going to be able to provide a service to me. And that is something that I think the carbon credits, the information that's in the carbon credit app portion of our reports. And for those of you listening, if you are a landowner and you're like, what are these guys talking about? You can go to landgate.com right now, create yourself an account, print your own report off on your own property. You can do that right now. That is something that doesn't cost you anything for your own property. There's a tool that Neil's been talking about where if this is what you do for a living and you want to know about it, if you're like me and you want to know about your neighbor's property too, or you want to know about that piece of property that's for sale down the road, you can get a very inexpensive, manageable subscription for $16 a month. You can do this across the United States, not just in a single state, but across the United States. So that's what Neil's been talking about. But when I don't want to sell my property, Neil, you can still work with me and I can work with you. Now I don't want to sell the property, but I'm going to come to you and say, hey, Neil, this looks interesting. We'd like to make some more money on the property. We've been growing alfalfa in that pivot for the last 10 years. Before that, we rotate crops in and out. For the most part, all we've been doing with this property is farming it. The corners, we don't do anything with it. There's a substation right next to it, though, or there is some other potential high revenue attribute to that property where you would look at it, Neil, as a land professional and say, hey, okay, well, that corner over there, that 15 acres that just basically sits there and you do nothing with it. You ever thought about and I know this is not about carbon credits, but it's everything that you were talking about before. Craig, you ever thought about putting a battery storage unit out there? Well, me as a landowner, I don't even know what you're talking about, Neil. And I darn sure don't know how to do it myself. But when I'm working with you, when I have a good representation of a land professional like you, I don't have to know anything. That's not my job. You as a land professional, you would do it for me. Here's all the different potential things that you might be able to make money for. Let's leverage the marketplace, get it out there and see what the market's willing to offer. And that's that fourth component. It's the landowner who, no matter what, I'm never going to sell this piece of property, right? And that's what I think there's a big opportunity, right?
So let me address. I'm gonna come at this this is personal experience, because somewhere out there's an agent or an investor, and you're pulling your hair out, going, oh my God, you just talked yourself out of selling that guy's land. I mean, so here's the truth. Here's the other side of this in my experience. You come at somebody with so much information and they started off with, I just want to sell my land. Can you help me? And in your effort to come across as an expert, which you are in their eyes already, and you start to talk about these things, you can kind of throw a monkey wrench into the whole deal of selling their land, and you might not get their listing. And so you got to be careful a little bit sometimes, because sometimes there's just too much information coming at them that now they get analysis paralysis because they don't want to make the wrong decision. So therefore they make no decision. And so there are times when I kind of felt like, I might have just kind of talked myself out of a listing there. And yes, I want to be viewed as an expert. I know that I know more than them. I know more than anybody that they've ever talked to. But now I've given them so many things to think about that they can't make a decision at all, and I lose my listing. So opportunity. So you gotta weigh that out a little bit. I would say there's a positive and there's a negative to this. The positive is when I sit in there and I come in with my ball cap with my logo and I'm dressed nice, and they see my billboards in the area and they go, man, I've been getting cards from you, and nobody has ever told me any of this. And I'm like, well, I want to be your partner. Unfortunately or fortunately, our money is made as agents usually with like a 30 to 60, maybe 90-day horizon. Like the transactions happen very quickly. And I have to be filling my funnel with 30-day and 60-day deals to pay the bills, to keep the long range things of marketing and becoming that market expert and building those relationships that, everybody talks about, relationships and farming relationships. That's all great, but it's not good at all if you're not listing and selling land. So I'm going to be upfront with the professionals out there, because you got to find that happy medium. You don't want to come in there and, throw up on them in a sense and say all this stuff to show them how knowledgeable you are, because you could talk yourself right out of a deal and they will get analysis paralysis. So that's just some experience, Craig. I don't know if that's something you want to say here, but that's where maybe you come at them initially and just say, find out what they want, understand their goals. You're here to serve them, hopefully, if you're ethical and honorable, and find out about what their desires are. They may be ready to sell, and that's the end of it. Or they may be really on the fence. And you start talking about carbon credits as an example, or any of the other resources that you choose to talk to that relate to their land. The next question is, okay, well, this isn't going to work. This property you don't want to sell this, but do you have another property that we could talk about? Oh yeah, I have this other, my uncle has this property and we've been wanting to sell it. And so utilizing this data and this knowledge and the software, it does elevate you to a different level, but it has the pros and cons of all this knowledge that's in my head sometimes. So you got to be a little aware of that, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say for the land professionals out there, or even the landowners, stick to what's relevant. We have enormous amounts of data and data points on every single parcel in the United States. Is every single parcel going to be really good for carbon credits? No. Is every parcel going to be good for solar? No. This is, to your point, Neil, understanding everything you can possibly know, good and bad, about that parcel. And for the land professionals listening, stick to what's relevant. If I'm the landowner and Neil, you come to me and tell me all of these things, but I already know I can't make money by mining gold in my backyard because never happened. And I'm a geologist, so I'm a weird odd case. I've tried to pan for gold in my backyard, didn't work. there's nothing there. So you don't need to reiterate that, but with that report and the data analytics, you can show me something that I may have not even comprehended. And I think that would be the focus there. But we do have some questions coming in here, Neil.
Okay.
So if you can help me get through these. The first one is from Isabel. She's got a two-part question here. What is the minimum acreage that would make sense for a property owner to go onto the marketplace for carbon credits? And then secondly, are you seeing any carbon credits awarded for vineyard land owners? I'll take a stab at that first. For the most part, carbon credits, the developers, the companies that are reaching out to landowners for those contracts are looking for very large parcels. Again, this is a very early stage of carbon credits in general. I think as time moves forward and more technological applications such as LandGate mature in the space, I think you're going to start seeing that even smaller landowners are going to be able to participate in there. So I would say it depends on what type of listing you had. It all comes back to how many tons of carbon dioxide is being sequestered and what area of the country you're in. If you're in the Great Plains of the Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, you're going to need a pretty large footprint. I mean, hundreds of acres, because the amount of tons of carbon being sequestered on grassland is relatively much lower than hardwood forests in West Virginia or rainforests in Oregon. Okay, so if you're in an area where the carbon load's very, very high, you can get down to, I've seen parcel contracts to 10, 15, up to, probably down to 10 or 15 acres, where multiple landowners have gotten together and there's a significant amount of carbon being sequestered there. So that's kind of on the lower side. We get that question almost in every webinar. What's the minimum acreage for solar, wind, carbon, all of those things? Carbon requires a bigger footprint than almost all of the other resources. Solar, you're now down to, I mean, a couple acres at this point. Battery storage, you can get down to a couple acres. EV charging, down to a third of an acre, right? So all of the other resources are open for basically parcel sizes. Carbon, you're going to need to be a little bit larger parcel there. And then on the vineyard land, Neil, I don't know about you, but I've heard of a company out there that was working with farmers in the Valley of California, with almond farmers, things like that. I think that would be probably the closest application to the vineyard that I've seen, but I haven't heard of a program specifically for vineyards. Have you, Neil?
No, and when that question was asked, I was kind of thinking, first off, the minimum. I would argue that it takes about the same amount of legal time to create a contract for a 10-acre vineyard as it would for a 10,000-acre wooded ranch or parcel. So I think it's more of a, if a company is going to take the time to sign up credits, and they got to spend 50 legal hours of payment to draft a document, they would likely just focus on a larger piece than the individual pieces. So the work involved is going to be harder. It's not to say that there aren't some boutique type companies that pop up, because they come and go all the time. Somebody popped up a question like, name the top 5. Well, the ones that I had in my head, some of them are already out of business. So it's changing and evolving. And again, I don't think it's a matter of like vineyard or orchard or hardwood. It's how much tons, carbon metric tons, or the measurement does that area produce, or absorb. That is going to be the deciding factor, unless there's a boutique type carbon registry that just loves West Coast Californian vineyards, and that's what they're focusing on. That's their segment, because as a business, they're very focused on that. They understand those owners and they're more knowledgeable. It's just market segmentation. I don't know that that type of person exists yet. I'm not aware of them, but I don't have vineyards where I'm at. So
yeah, I would imagine, like we said, it's a very, very early stage for carbon credits. And it seems almost on a weekly or monthly basis, there's a new brand of carbon developer out there that's looking for a specific niche of land use type for carbon credit. So I'm not aware of one specifically looking for vineyards yet, but that's likely coming.
yeah.
And then here's one that I'm going to need your help on this one, because we had plenty of conversations with land professionals and landowners asking the same thing. And this is a question from Jenny here. She plans to purchase some land and put it into a conservation easement. How does a conservation easement and carbon credits work together? Can you do, and what we've been saying, and you let me know what you think, Neil, is they are two separate things. You have conservation easements and you have carbon credit, essentially lease contracts, where I think if you do it correctly and you play your cards right, you may be able to do both at the same time. Neil, what's your opinion on that?
I don't know that I have an opinion if you can do it on the same time, but let's make the assumption that you can. I think the decision revolves around what encumbrances have you just put on your property. Because I could tell you let me talk about conservation easements first. I have a number of conservation easement owners that have come to me saying, I have this property. Usually they're in like a wetland, grassy wetland in my area, and it was put into a conservation easement 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they were paid $110,000. I'm picking numbers, but $110,000 to put your property in this easement. And then in one case, public use was now allowed, but they thought, oh, I don't use it. That's fine. Okay, give me my $100,000. Hunting was allowed. Hiking was allowed. It became almost like a public park, but they were given money up front and they needed it and they were happy to do it. But what you did was significantly reduce what I, as a land specialist agent, could now sell your property at. So 10 years later, they come back to me and they have spent through that $100,000 that they initially received. And now they want to sell this land, and the land in their area is going for $5,000 an acre. And they've got this beautiful, I'm picturing one in Chippewa County, Wisconsin, rolling grassland, kind of oak savannas, wetland, ponds, just a beautiful piece of property, but nobody will buy it because it's in a conservation easement forever and ever, and it's perpetual. You've given up your rights to that. And I would almost argue, and I don't want to get in this too much, but the people that signed up in those, got you to sign that conservation easement, know that eventually it's almost worthless on the open market. And if you're okay with that, like you want to give it up as a perpetual gift to society, and you just turn it over to that entity, it's a conservation service, and because that's what you really value, well, then it might work out really well. But what I find most often is people don't want to just turn over that right to that, and they can't sell it. And it almost, I'm not going to say it becomes worthless because there's value on a biological perspective, but from a sales and marketing perspective, I'm almost never been able to sell a property like that. Or if I did, it's less than half of the market value. That's what I've seen people are willing to pay. So you got paid up front, but you sold it for half the value later. And in the meantime, that property value has climbed over the years. And that could be significant. The loss can be significant. So I'd be careful about that. And then when you combine that with a contract for carbon, if it's a 1-year agreement, like my buddy in Ohio did, not a big deal. But if you get into a 20-year agreement, maybe the next buyer doesn't want a double whammy with people involved in my property telling me what I can do. And so in their mind, it's worth less. So those are some things that I think you need to consider, Jenny.
Very good. I think that brings up a good point. Is what is their goal? What do they ultimately want to do with the property? If they're trying to put a habitat together, could work out really, really well for them. So very good intel there, Neil. Another question: is there a fee to list your property on the site? No. For any of those resources, it doesn't matter what you're wanting. You can list your property for multiple resources. Test the water if you want. For any of the topics that we've discussed today, there is no listing fee. There is no commission to do that yourselves. So there is that option. And then also, if you are interested in working with a qualified land professional just like Neil in your area, let us know and we can connect you with some of the users of LandGate that way as well. And then one more, we're getting pretty close to the end here. We'll try to get through as many more questions as we can. But someone asked a question: please address the need for additionality in the voluntary marketplace for nature-based solutions. That term additionality is quite interesting in the current carbon space. For those of you who have gone back through the YouTube link that Jordan put in the chat there, you can go back and listen to another webinar that we had talking about carbon credits of a carbon developer / registry that does not like at all the additionality term. And what that means is, very quickly, is whatever your property is doing right now, or a property is doing right now and has been for the last 3 years, is what's considered a baseline. How much carbon dioxide and what operational practices did you have on that property to levelize, or at least normalize, how much carbon dioxide is being sequestered on that property? They look at the last 3 years. That's your baseline. The additionality component of carbon credits means that there's some registries and there's some companies out there that will say they will only compensate for the additionality component. So whatever you've been doing for the last 3 years, great, but it doesn't really matter as far as the additionality goes. What they'll say is if Neil, your client or your landowner, Neil, you as a landowner, you make some operational practices, you make changes to increase the amount of carbon dioxide being sequestered on your property, they will pay you for the additionality above what your baseline is. Now, I won't go into the full details on that, but I really don't like the idea of additionality because I know personally that there's some folks on the agricultural side who are reverting back to really, really poor practices, management practices, just to simply lower their baseline. So they increase yield as much as possible, not good at all for soil health, and they are going to do everything they can to lower their baseline for 3 years, qualify for a higher carbon credit, which that's not the idea. That's not the spirit of what carbon credits are for. So again, it's very, very early. I think there's some good changes that can be made, but Neil, I'd like to hear you get a chance to jump in on that as well.
Well, I'm into soil health as well, and the idea that somebody would degrade their property so they could reset the baseline and to get a bigger payoff, to me is very short-sighted. And that's the first time I've ever heard of that. But it doesn't surprise me that there's people out there that try to game the system. I just don't even know what to say about that. But if you want to degrade, something that is a God-given resource and there's only so much of it, I don't even know if I have a comment, Craig. I'll be honest with you. That's crazy to think.
And that's it. It goes back to the different landowner profiles. Now, I'm from the heartland of America. I'm from an agricultural community. My in-laws are farmers and ranchers. Their land is everything they have in the world. That is their most prized possession, is their land, and they would never do this. But then there's other folks, like you said, Neil, if it's a satellite owner, they'll never even see the property. They're banking it. They want to make as much revenue as possible. It sets up those types of scenarios. And that's actually a pretty decent segue, Neil, into wrapping this up is that, what we try to do is provide as much information about every piece of property that's available for the landowners listening. And I'm one of them. I'm not listening, but I am one of these landowners. My land is my most valuable asset in the world. I want to know as much about it as possible. I want to protect mine as much as possible. But if I can make some money on it as well while doing those things, very, very good. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. What we're going to be talking about in our next year's webinar series goes to some of those satellite ownership and the difference between maybe how these people treat their land versus somebody who's homesteaded it and passed down through generations, things like that. We're going to have some webinars talking about how the land dynamic is changing throughout the United States of America, of having less traditionally farm-owned, smaller farms, and much more larger corporate owners. And a really interesting topic that I think people are going to really appreciate is touching on international foreign entity land ownership. Where do certain countries that may not like us right now in our society, where do they own property? What are they doing strategically, and what do they actually own? So have some really exciting stuff coming up this year, but we are at the top of the hour. If we did not get to your question, I think there's a couple left. We will email you and follow up. But Neil, thank you so much again. Anybody on the call who has questions, needs to work with a land professional, Neil, as far as anybody around, the Wisconsin area, neighboring states, Neil is your guy. He is very, very knowledgeable about all these topics. Clearly, his email contact information is in the chat. That will also be sent out along with the video. But Neil, thank you so much. Anything you'd like to add before we leave?
I just say I'm glad to have a conversation with anybody that wants to call me anywhere in the country. And I'm pretty positive that I could hook you up with a land specialist agent that's very similar to myself, as we have agents in 43 states and growing. So reach out to me and I'll get you hooked up to the right guy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neil. Again, everybody, thanks for attending. Any questions about your property, go to landgate.com, take a look at your property, file a report, and we will see you guys on the next one.